Thank you to everyone who's joined tonight's event via the webinar or live on YouTube or on Facebook. We will get started in about 30 seconds. And again, thank you to everyone who is joining via the webinar or YouTube or Facebook. We are about to get started for tonight's social justice in Chicago, 1 year after George Floyd's killing. Here is Elvia Malagón.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Social Justice in Chicago, 1 year after George Floyd's killing. We have a great panel lined up tonight, and that includes Kobe Gillior, the co-chair of the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, Jonathan Swain, a local business owner and president and CEO of Link Unlimited Scholars, Jesse Fuentes, co-founder of the Illinois Latino Agenda 2.0, the Reverend Damon Smith, organizer with the Community Renewal Society, Jasmine Roach, a student leader with Voice. Some of you all have already submitted questions ahead of this panel, and we will get to that later. And if anyone has a question as the discussion is going, you could submit questions either in the chat box, or there's also a Q&A function for those of you who are on the Zoom. And before we get started, we just want to take a moment to thank the Chicago Community Trust. Thanks to their support, all of the stories that I write are not behind a paywall, but we do encourage you to consider supporting local journalism by getting a Chicago Sun-Times subscription. And I also just realized I didn't introduce myself. So I'm Elvia Malagón, and I'm a reporter here at the Chicago Sun-Times, and I focus on issues dealing with social justice and wage inequality. So to start off, on May 25th, 2020, Minneapolis police initially described what happened to George Floyd as a medical incident. But a video filmed by a teen who witnessed it all showed how a Minneapolis police officer knelt on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, killing him. Watching the video and hearing as Floyd in his last moments called out for his mother set off a wave of protest across the country, including here in Chicago. And it renewed and amplified longstanding calls to not only reform police, but to rethink public safety entirely. Since 2019, the Chicago Police Department has been under a consent decree requiring it to make reforms to discipline, supervision, training, and recruiting. And now, a year after last summer's protests, some community groups are disappointed by the slow progress of changes here in Chicago. So let's dive right into some of those reforms groups are still pushing for, since we have a lot of ground to cover. To start off, one of the biggest reforms that we will likely be hearing a lot more about this month, especially as we get closer to the city council meeting later this month, is civilian oversight of the police department. So to start off, Kobe, can you tell us a little bit about the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Ordinance and how it came together?
Yeah, thank you, Elvia. So my name is Kobe Gilliry. I am a co-chair of the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And just a word about the protest last year. I just want to say, you know, it was all over the country because, you know, in every major city, not even just major cities, in every city in this country, you know, there are George Floyds, there are Breonna Taylors. You know, here in Chicago, there's Pierre Laurie, you know, there's Laquan McDonald, there's Betty Jones, Flint Farmer. And, you know, so this is something that everyone in every city can relate to. And it's been happening for a very, very long time. You know, as long as I've been alive, and as long as a lot of people in the city have been alive, police have been killing people with impunity, particularly Black and brown people. And the solution that people have come to is that communities need to be empowered to to make the changes, to make the systemic changes that need to happen, so that to stop police violence, and um, to make sure that no parent has to go through seeing their child murdered on TV by the police. So, um, what the Chicago Alliance has been pushing for a few years previously was CPAC, um, the Civilian Police Accountability Council, and parallel to us, with a few differences, was a coalition. We have a member of the coalition here, Reverend Damon, from the GAPA coalition, the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability. And so we had sort of been working parallel to each other for a few years, pushing in city council in our different ways. And it became clear last year that the mayor was, no matter what we push, was going to be an obstacle to any sort of police accountability. Because her response to the protests was to raise bridges and trap protesters, and arrest thousands of people on May 30th last year. And then to continue that policy throughout the year, throughout the summer of protests, having police just brutalize young Black people in every part of the city. Um, and of course, she said that she was going to come up with some police accountability ordinance a very, very long time ago, 2 years ago. She said that she was going to do it in 100 days, and she just recently did come up with an ordinance which was essentially just plagiarizing the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Ordinance. Um, but more about the ordinance. So CPAC and GAPA came together and began to negotiate what a joint ordinance would look like, a united ordinance between um, our two organizations, our two coalitions, that would sort of unite the best of both worlds and combine our community power, our political capital, so that we could get something through city council. And what we came up with was ECPS, and ECPS sort of empowers, creates district councils and council commissioners, which will have the final say over CPD policy and will have input into how the superintendent of police is chosen. And it also institutes a referendum, which gives the people of Chicago the choice to go further, because uh, there are certain election laws that sort of restrict who can be directly elected in this city. These are state laws that you need a referendum to bypass. So of course you put the referendum in this ordinance, and that referendum um, give will give people the right to determine whether or not they want these councils to be directly elected, and whether or not they want these councils to have more control over things like the budget and direct power over the superintendents of police. So that's a very brief overview of what ECPS is. We've been pushing very, very hard in the community, um, passing out all kinds of literature, speaking with people every day, every week. We've been doing phone banking, tabling, flyering, and we've had rallies outside city council, outside alderpersons' offices. So this is very much a campaign that's in full swing. And coming up this month on the 18th is the next public safety committee meeting, where we'll finally, thanks to so much pressure on the part of the people, on the part of our communities, we've gotten that vote in the public safety committee, and we're up against this mayor's ordinance, which like I said earlier, is essentially a plagiarized version of our ordinance, but with all the teeth taken out, without the power to decide on policy, of course, without the referendum. Um, it's something that uh, keeps power in the mayor's hands, and of course, um, maintains the status quo that has been killing so many Black and brown people in this city. So thank you for inviting me on this panel, and I look forward to answering the question.
Yeah, and can you tell us about, I know Jesse in the chat mentioned that there's 17 days left until the Public Safety Committee vote. Kind of what are the big dates that people should look out for in regards to this ordinance?
Well, so the next Public Safety Committee vote is on the 7th, is on the 18th, 17 days away. And after that, the full meeting of the City Council is on the 23rd. So the way that an ordinance works is that it gets voted on in the relevant committee, which in this case is the Public Safety Committee. And then if it gets voted through that committee, it goes to the full City Council, the full 50 the full 50 board of alderpersons for a full vote, after which it becomes a law in the city of Chicago. And we're putting pressure on the specific alderpersons who are members of the Public Safety Committee right now, because we need their vote on the 18th of June. And you know, we at every step of the way, we have encouraged people to put pressure on their alderpersons, especially people in certain places, in certain wards where the alderpersons have been, you know, on the fence about whether or not they want to support this ordinance that was written by and for the people. So those are the two major dates, the 18th and the 23rd. We have information out on all of our social media. I'll put those in the chat. I don't know if the attendees can see it, but I'll put all our social media information in the chat, where you can find more information, more updates, and the full text of the ECPS ordinance is also available on our website. So I'll post the links to that as well.
Another large protest that we saw, especially starting last summer and continuing throughout the year, was we saw a lot of protests led by students calling for the removal of police officers from public schools. Jasmine, you're involved with Voices of Youth in Chicago Education. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with that and the work that you guys have been doing this past year?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jasmine. How I got involved with Voice is they reached out to our schools. They basically came to like flyers, they waved it around. They asked youth, mainly juniors and seniors, to reach out because, you know, freshmen and sophomores not really into like meeting and stuff like that. So I got involved with it because they mostly talked about mental health in the Black and brown community, which caught my attention. And at first I was hesitant to come because I was really scared to come. And so the second time I came, and when they first did a meeting, they mostly talked about the violence in Chicago and also the George Floyd thing. And so that's how I got involved. And what we have been doing was trying to get rid of the SROs in our schools, which was a success, but not all the way. We're still trying to work on it, especially on the south side of Chicago. Right now, we are mainly focused on our mental health programs and trying to reach out to other schools to talk about getting rid of the SROs in the other schools and mental health programs. Where can we use the money to, instead of giving it to the police officers, where else can we give it to? And that's basically what we are doing right now.
Yeah, and the reallocation of funds, that's been a big theme throughout the past year. Jasmine, can you tell us a little bit about, you know, if the resources could be reallocated from, you know, what is spent on SROs, what would you like to see in your school or in other schools in the city?
One main thing that we're also, what we want it to go to is the mental health programs, because suicide is really high in the Black and Brown communities. Also more therapy, especially Black and Brown therapists, because we can relate to them more and not Americans, no offense. We want more Black and Brown therapists, social workers. We also want more programs for our education if we need help with that. We also talked about more lunches, because they do serve bad lunches in our communities. And one more thing is the LGBT programs. We also need that in our Black and Brown communities.
And Jonathan, through your work with Link Unlimited Scholars, you're also pretty involved with students. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the kinds of conversations that you all have had with students, especially since this past year has been so tumultuous.
Absolutely. First, thank you for having me. And it's great to be on this panel with such esteemed guests. Our students clearly were not surprised by what they saw. They're on the ground in the neighborhoods. They know what's going on. I think the biggest place where they were surprised really was the reaction and the global reaction. I mean, I always talked about being national, but the global reaction to a people of goodwill that are standing up saying, look, enough is enough. And I think that's kind of what shook a lot of our students. And I think what it did was it gave them a new perspective on leadership. I think to this point, a lot of our students were thinking that leadership had to be something that was top down, and really they're realizing really leadership is bottom up, and that they can be a leader and they can step into the cause. And so what we saw a lot of was a lot of our students getting involved with direct action, involved with protest, not only just in the streets around Chicago, but also in their schools, calling for different kind of DEI councils in schools and different kind of diversity kind of initiatives in schools. So it was really inspiring to them in many ways, and now they can see that change really starts with them, and that they can lend their hand to the plow, if you will, to break up the ground as necessary. So yeah.
And as we mentioned before, the police department is already under a consent decree. And Damon, the Community Renewal Society was part of a group of organizations that actually filed a federal lawsuit to pretty much make sure that community groups had a say in this. So I was wondering if you could tell us where that stands as of today.
Sure, I can. Thank you very much for having me here and having all of us here. I echo Jonathan's sentiments with such illustrious panel. I'm glad to be a part of it. Yes, Community Renewal Society, affectionately known as CRS, is part of the coalition that pushed for a consent decree to happen here in the city of Chicago. We understand that the Department of Justice recognized that the CPD has used patterns of excessive force, basically what we want to call it, against people of color, primarily against people of color. And we knew that a federal consent decree needed to be in place to address some of these issues of CPD. Where it stands, the decree has our federal monitor, and they have organized and asked for members of the community to make recommendations for the Chicago Police Department to follow, for the city of Chicago to adhere to. And out of 100 plus recommendations, only 5 were accepted as of this moment. One of them was in regards to the resource officers in schools. One was also in regards to chases, foot chases, and also auto chases as well. And also just the conduct and practices of arresting individuals. How do you apprehend individuals? Should you and when should the CPD be involved in the apprehension of individuals? So we've been working diligently to bring the community voices to the table, and not just bring them to the table, but have a voice at the table that is listened to and followed up on. And so we are still in, I don't want to call the word negotiations, but conversations where we have provided a list of over 100 plus recommendations to the CPD, to the city of Chicago. Only as of this moment, 5 have been accepted. We're still pushing for more for the various working groups that are meeting with our federal monitor, with CPD, with the administration, and with the community organizations that are from across the city of Chicago, representing these communities that have been hurt, that have been harmed, and that have been put in danger because of police misconduct. And so where we are right now, we are still fighting to have more of our recommendations listened to and put into place to help reform the Chicago Police Department.
And you mentioned the foot pursuit policy. I was going to ask you about that just because that's something, the temporary policy was one of the things that recently came up a couple of weeks ago. And it seemed to get a lot of attention, in particular because of the police fatally shooting 13-year-old Adam Toledo. So I was wondering what you thought of that policy the temporary policy as it stands now, and if you think there's anything missing from it.
What is missing from it is the same thing that's missing from most, if not all, of the police misconduct reforms that are put in place. And Kobe can definitely scream to this, as can Jesse, the community. Where's the community's input? And there is this myth that the community wants to have all the power and take all the power away from CPD and the mayor's office. And that's simply not true. We want to work in collaboration with, right? The community wants to have a voice in how they are policed, because what has been happening has not worked. Lives have been lost. Individuals of people of color, LGBTQIA individuals, when they have an interaction with the police, are not knowing if they're going to make it home because there's not enough accountability. And the community is saying, we want to have input on how you police our schools and if you should police our schools, how you should engage in foot pursuits, how you should engage in automobile or vehicle pursuits, how you should apprehend someone, how you should be in these negotiations and these conversations with individuals from the community. And that is what is missing throughout the entire process. The community has to have a voice that is listened to, not just at the table, not just present, but has a voice that has reforms that will be followed, that will be law, that everyone has to know, everyone has to understand, and everyone has to follow.
And for Damon or anyone else, why don't you think that City Hall is taking into account those voices?
Well, it's easier, right, to manage a policy that is internal. To manage voices outside of City Council and outside of CPD takes effort and work, but it also takes resources, right? Being able to create those forums, to fund those spaces, to recruit the voices, to be able to ensure that there's equitable voice in those spaces. There has to be someone in the city from the mayor's office and from CPD willing to dedicate the resources and the time. And I think that that has been the biggest question. Is reform area that the city wants to invest time and resources into?
You know, I'll add another comment to this. You know, that's why organizing is so important, because it raises pressure, it raises voice, and it brings people together. I mean, within the sphere of politics, people respond to masses that show up. You know, I was told when I was growing up in politics, they would say it's not the loudest people in the room, it's the most present people in the room to get action. And so when you look at, you know, just basic turnout when it comes to mayoral and aldermanic elections, 7 out of 10 registered voters in Chicago don't vote. And so when we think about the low turnout and kind of the low engagement, there's a presumption that there's only certain folks that have to be listened to. And as that number goes up, then that presumption goes away. And that's why I laud all those that are involved in organizing around the city, because what it does is it takes those that maybe not be engaged, gets them engaged, and pushes the envelope to really answer a lot of these questions when they need to be answered.
And Jesse, I was wondering, you're one of the co-founders of the Illinois Latino Agenda 2.0. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that came together and what police-related reforms you all are pushing for.
Absolutely. The Illinois Latino Agenda 2.0 is a convening coalition body. We convene all Latino organizations, leaders across the state, really to discuss an equity agenda. And that's on all fronts, right? There's a lot of equity issues, and, you know, my co-panelists here can attest that, you know, we're fighting on many different fronts outside of police reform in the city of Chicago. This year, recently, we've witnessed the murder of 13-year-old Adam Toledo and a young man named Anthony Alvarez. And we know that police accountability is not front and center as we're discussing reform. When we first heard of the murder of Adam Toledo, CPD had posted on Twitter that it was a gun altercation, right? Not allowing for the process to take place and for true transparency to lead the discussion, right? And many people were muzzled by that statement that Adam Toledo allegedly had engaged in a gun altercation with CPD. It didn't allow for the masses to be moved quickly around his justice. We're demanding for a federal investigation of the Adam Toledo murder because we don't fully understand the events that transpired from that event from beginning to end. We have also been demanding for an immediate moratorium to suspend foot pursuits, right? And I wholeheartely agree with Reverend Smith on everything that's missing from that revised policy. We have to understand what foot pursuits do in altercation with CPD and civilians. You put police officers in a high foot pursuit with someone that they already have a perception is doing something illegal. You're putting them in a high climatic, emotional state. There is no one, not you or I, that's going to make a rational decision on a high foot pursuit chase, let alone CPD officers that have belts with lethal weapons. And we have to recognize that. CPD walks the streets in our neighborhoods with lethal weapons, weapons that put us in our graves. But they're forced to make split decisions during a foot pursuit. And what we've seen, it kills our young people. And so I don't think that a revised foot pursuit policy is enough, especially when it doesn't include the voices of the communities in which those policies impact the most. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And we expect a full suspension of that policy until community voices heard.
One of the questions, we've talked a lot about policies that are still fluid and still happening, but someone asked, what substantial changes, if any, do you guys think have happened here in Chicago since the large-scale protests that followed George Floyd's murder?
We have to look at the last year in context, right? And we all seen it, right? We all seen several police officers kneeling with protesters. It was televised, business owners, elected officials, all of them for the first time standing up in front of cameras, recognizing the racial injustices that exist within police departments. And many folks benefited from those actions being televised. But we have to be honest about what's happening at the policy level. Not much has changed. We've all seen a year of protests. We've all seen several people that we would not have expected to stand with us. That hasn't impacted legislation. Unfortunately, that hasn't turned the world right side up. And we have to really start digging deep. Kneeling with protesters, making statements, releasing press statements hasn't made a dent. And we have to ask ourselves why.
And if I may also add, and I totally agree with you, Jesse, 100%. The evolution of our democracy is requiring a much more engaged citizenry. And they're here. They're here. They are armed with information. They are armed with research. They are armed with statistics. They are armed with lived experiences that heretofore were not appreciated, that were not listened to, that were not, given audience. So now we have everything we need. It's now time for the government, regardless of who's in office, to listen to the people. The community has lived experiences, and they're not going to suffer in silence anymore. They are not willing to just protest anymore. They want to see policies change, right? Because that's really what it's going to come down to. The policies have to change. They have to evolve. Our government has to evolve. The citizenry has evolved and is much more active. It's much more inclusive. It is much more diverse. It is much more well-informed. It is much more engaged, and they voice their frustrations in ways never seen before, right? So now it's time for the responses to these frustrations to happen. And that's what's missing now. The community has spoken. The community is doing the work. The community has gotten the petitions. They've gotten flyers. They've registered folks to vote. They are attending meetings. Now it's time for that action to be reflected in the policies that change.
Yeah, I agree with the others who have spoken, and I just want to add, one policy that that I've seen that was a victory was the ending of money bond, and that was, of course, because of so much pressure on the part of organizers and on the part of our communities, and it's going to be the same with any policy you put through. It's not politicians don't lead the way of struggles. It's the communities that do, because there are interests, there are corporations who they don't care about the communities in the city. They just care about whether or not they can put up a new development, or whether or not they can run a certain kind of business. And what happens is our communities get neglected, and when they're neglected, they're also over-policed. And these policies come out of this deeply, deeply entrenched, systematic neglect and disenfranchisement and over-policing of our communities that's been going on in some form or another for the past 400 years. So it's going to take more. The fact that the historic mobilization that happened last year didn't completely uproot the system, I think, is just shows how deeply entrenched the system is and how much sustained and committed work it's going to take to uproot it. The last thing I'll say is that we're, I think, in a different political climate than we were in at the beginning of 2020. And that's because so much has moved. So many people, like Reverend Damon said, so many people have been activated, politicized, and it's kind of a chain reaction. They politicize other people. They're having conversations. They're moving. They're motivating and mobilizing, their friends, their family members, and communities. And that's putting us in a place where, the mayor cannot slander Adam Toledo in a press conference and then call herself a progressive. The city has seen that the emperor has no clothes, and political change has to happen after that, because we're in a different moment than we were at last year. So in terms of policy change, there has been very little, but there is all the reason to be optimistic because people have been mobilized and motivated, organized.
And I'll just add that I agree. Policy is where it starts and where it ends. I mean, you've seen some shake up in terms of what people believe and where their hearts are and the like. But, time will tell whether you see that if their actions continue with where they say they are. And I think that'll take time. But I will give kudos on the work that was done at the state, this session with Illinois Black Caucus, the Black Caucus down in the State House. They did pass some legislation. So it's not necessarily where we all want to be on a lot of different issues, but what you can see that there was a crack in the dam that allowed people to push forward things like no cash bail and like a few other things that were done down there. Is it all perfect? No, but I think you're starting to see it as the citizenry continues to stay engaged, that you'll begin to see more and more change around these particular issues as we bring people forward, talking about the things that matter to the community.
Absolutely. The last thing I want to add is that what we've seen in 2020 was communities who have been traumatized by systemic racism, right? And the most marginalized communities across the nation take their pain and use it for fuel to move the system, right? And we've seen that all over the country. It's extremely important for us to continue to demand for community-driven legislation. And the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Ordinance is a great beginning for what that can look like in the city of Chicago. It's extremely important for folks to get behind that, for communities to have voice, for there to be oversight, accountability, and transparency. We know that police accountability is not the end of systemic racism, but it is the very beginning that we need to start with. And I know there are a lot of people who have questions around policing, right? And what does it mean to defund the police? What does it mean to have reform? Do you not want police in your community? What we're saying is that there needs to be absolute transparency and accountability, and that communities should be in charge of what it means to be accountable when that does not happen. And that's not a system we have today. And it's extremely important that we recognize the pain of communities that is being spoken today, right? And what all of 2020 looked like. These are people who are in pain. Those protests that we've seen weren't for show. Those were people for the first time being vulnerable enough to say, I'm going to rip my sleeve off, and you're going to see how much pain we're in.
And Jonathan, going back to the protests, you're also a local business owner, and your business was also impacted by the protests. I wondered if you could talk about, if you felt like there were enough resources, especially to business owners on the South Side and West Side like you are, and what more could be done, or if you guys have been able to get back on your feet.
Yeah, thankfully, yes. So I own a business in Hyde Park, Kim Bar Beverage Shop, and we were one of the first businesses to be hit. We were hit at like 1:30 in the morning on May 31st. So, we are grateful to the community support that we received. I mean, community neighbors helped us as we were closed, keep all of our folks paid through the time that they were off, and they really stepped up. And so our business has been people have really responded, especially in this era of Black economic consciousness, that people have really responded to trying to support businesses that have been in and around and from the community. And my business has been in my family since 1974. So we've been there a long time. When it comes to the resources, I do think resources are being distributed to a lot of businesses, and you see a lot of new businesses that are coming online, businesses that are being rebuilt in the community. But at the end of the day, I think I'm not sure if it was Reverend or Jesse that said it. It's a drop in the bucket when you look historically at the policies that have been enacted when it comes to the racial wealth gap, economic disenfranchisement. It's kind of a drop in the bucket. And so I think the question becomes, how do we enact policy going forward so that we can continue to see this economic development? For example, there are a lot of stories that have been going around on the internet about the disparity in appraisals, about how one person can own a home, a Black person can own a home, and a white person could be in that same home and they get two separate appraisals. Well, that wealth that's being stolen, if you will, because of racial bias, impacts the ability to send kids to school. It impacts the ability to start businesses and the like. So I think there's a larger question around how these things need to be addressed. But I think that there's a pioneering spirit that's out there of business that's really, and I know sometimes in the business world, there's a disconnect between business and community. I think that there are a lot of questions and conversations that are being had now where business and community are trying to come closer and tie themselves together. Because at the end of the day, small business folks and folks on the street are really the same folks.
Yeah, and the reader, kind of going into that, a reader had a question about, they asked what is the solution, but maybe multiple solutions to the issue of the disinvestment that has happened historically here in Chicago and many communities, especially, the reallocation of funds. What can be done to kind of help some of those communities that, for decades haven't gotten the type of investment that other communities have?
I'll start, and I think the Reverend would appreciate this. You could preach a sermon all day on this question, and do 2 or 3 or 4 of them actually. I think part of it is we have to stop looking at the question of investment or disinvestment as a thing that belongs to them. Well, a lot of times we hear this conversation about, what do we do in those communities? Well, there are communities. We're part of one city. We're part of one Chicago. And we have to recognize that disinvestment that has not happened on the South and West sides affects the entirety of the city. Just like the overinvestment in particular areas affects the entirety of the city. So I think, one, it's a mind shift that has to happen. Secondly, I don't think it can be we start in one place and let that be the panacea. There's housing, there's schools, there's mental health, there's education. There's a whole lot of different places that need to be addressed all at the same time. I mean, I think Dr. King talks about it when he talks in his last book. He talks about we should deal with the issue of poverty through universal basic income. And I think that's where it starts for a lot of people. And I think studies are starting to show that might be a real solution to the problem. But I think ultimately it's about what was been discussed throughout this theme throughout this is people need to be engaged with the process. The fewer people are engaged, the more things that can happen that don't affect the people. I heard a guy say it this way. He said, if you say you're doing something for me, without me, you're really doing it to me. And so I think that as we when we don't get involved and participate, things are being done to us. I think it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to find ways that we can get all of those who have been sitting on the sidelines involved in the conversation, because the more people are involved, the more that people will have to listen to what the needs are of the community. And I think that will drive some of the investment. And I think that will prevent some of the atrocities that we've seen on the South and West sides for many, many years.
No, absolutely. Go ahead, Reverend.
Jesse, go ahead. No, go ahead, Jesse.
I completely agree with Jonathan. I also want to recognize there's a double-edged sword that communities of color, specifically Black and Brown communities, face in the city of Chicago. That's disinvestment. But we also have to look at the communities that are being completely gentrified in the city of Chicago. Either you're not invested in at all, or your community is invested in, and that very investment displaces the community that calls that place home, right? I think that there is a very beginning start that the mayor, for example, can take, that she's going to receive a ton of money with the COVID-19 Heroes Fund. She should invest every single dollar of that fund to communities of color across the city of Chicago. Specifically, communities of color we know do not have schools that have enough social workers, do not have youth development spaces, do not have mental health clinics, do not have equitable clinics, FQHCs in communities to ensure that our folks are healthy. She should invest that money to ensure that she's addressing at a policy level health disparities that come from inequities and structural racism in our community. She has to start with investing the money she does have. She invested a ton of money in the last round of COVID-19 funds to CPD. So I would love to see her invest the next round of funds to communities.
And Jonathan's trying to get me to preach today, and I promise you I'm not going to do that. But one of the things that must happen is that we have to change how we see people. The officer in Minneapolis saw George as an other. Mm-hmm. So many of our members of our government and law enforcement see people of color as other. They see members of the LGBTQIA as others. They're not others. They're human beings who have the exact same rights and privileges as you do. And if you do not want someone leaning on your neck with their knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, then guess what you cannot do to anybody else? And I know that sounds simple and cliche, but that's really the root of all of this. Why do some communities have investments and others don't? Because we see them as other. Why are some individuals allowed to go wherever they want in their merry way and someone cannot because they're an other? Why do we see disinvestment or overinvestment, over policing or militarized policing in certain communities? Because we see others. So that's number one. Even with income, men are still paid 2/3 more than women because women are seen as an other, right? So we have to change how we see individuals. They're all people who all should have the same rights, protections, privileges as every other human being, period, dead stop. For example, I'm just going to throw this out there. If property taxes are part of the formula that fund our schools, then why don't we take all the property taxes and divide them up for the number of children in school, period, regardless of where they live, regardless of where they worship, regardless of their income of their parents, dead stop, and give everyone the exact same amount of money to fund their education. It should not, well, my multi-million dollars can't cross, Austin, or it can't cross Sheffield, or it can't cross Belmont, or it can't cross 116th or 26th Street or Western. The dollar doesn't know it should stop there. People do, right? Because we see those on the other side of the street, across the street as an other, they should not get what we get. And then we also need to start looking at this economic model that says everyone deserves a piece of a pie. How about make more damn pies? Right? I mean, so we need to look at how we see funding, how we see protecting, how we see providing, how we see securing everyone. When I've talked to individuals who are pro-police in the George Floyd case, and they talk about, he was accused of this crime and, he had a counterfeit $20 bill, et cetera. I actually will give them that. I say, okay, the officer denied him his day in court. At minimum, doesn't everyone accused of a crime deserve their day in court? Officers should not be doing that. And when they heard that language, they said, well, then, yeah, maybe we should not encourage officers. There should be some accountability because they're denying people their day in court. However we have to get there is how we need to get there. That everyone deserves rights, privileges, protection, especially when they're paying tax dollars to get it. They're not paying to be abused. They're paying to be provided for. They're paying to be provided. They're paying to be protected, not abused. And that's where our system needs to change.
And
yeah, I just want to add just one quick thing. There's the reason one of the demands that came out of the protest last year was to defund the police, is that in pretty much every city, as you see education and healthcare and housing budgets decreasing, the budgets for the police go up steadily pretty much every year. And it's very obvious if you just look at the numbers, that has no effect on actually keeping people safe. That doesn't decrease murders. It doesn't decrease any sort of violent crimes. All it does is increase the root causes of the crimes, the poverty, the disenfranchisement, the alienation. That's what needs to be looked at. What needs to be remedied. People need more resources. As others have said, people need more resources in order to live better lives. That's the bottom line. And in order to get those resources, in order to make sure that communities maintain those resources, they need to be empowered over the institutions which affect their lives.
And how do you all think, looking ahead to the future, that last summer's protests, how will they be remembered, sort of like the legacy of them?
I think it depends on who you ask. This is not a moment we haven't seen before in the country when you look at the kind of the things that happened in 1967, 1968, and then you looked at the responses of that. I mean, what we're living out right now when it comes to some of the pressures around kind of this kind of law and order, tough on crime mentality, it came out of the response to 68 and 67. So I think for us, I think it will, and people in this group and around this circle, we'll see that as a turning point, a memorable point, I think a generational shifting moment, partly because it was amplified by the pandemic. I don't know how this would have happened, or this would have how the response to the George Floyd's murder would have happened had the pandemic not slowed us all down to stop and to look and to think about what was happening. I mean, what now we know is 9 minutes and 29 seconds ticked by, partly because our lives were slower in the midst of a pandemic. So I think when you marry those two things together, this will be a transformative moment that generations will be able to look back to and say, this is when the moment when we began to see some real change. And if you look in the context of the history, you begin to see kind of another reconstruction coming out of this, justice and equity, and us living up to the promise of what America was supposed to be.
I also believe that this is going to be a moment that continues for decades ahead of us to inspire young people to become activated and mobilized. What we seen in 2020 was young people completely lead the way. I mean, we have Jasmine Roach on the call. We have young people who protested to ensure that SROs are no longer in schools. We made sure that, young people were the voices and the faces of the movement. They voiced their concerns. They were honest about their trauma. I think that this is going to be a moment in history that continues to inspire young people to believe in themselves as agents of change. And we've seen that in 2020.
Agreed.
And Jasmine, since you are the young leader here in this group, what do you think, or how do you want the protest and the work that you've been doing, how do you want it to be remembered?
I want it to be remembered with teenagers leading it, because as you can see, the adults was leading it at first, but I want the teenagers to go out and be remembered that we actually changed something, that we did something, that we helped our community. That's how I want it to be remembered.
Sorry, anyone else want to weigh in?
Well, I just want to offer to Jasmine as a nearing elder statesman, let me just let you know that there are those of us who are in this age group who are your biggest cheerleaders, who are your loudest supporters, who are willing to be more than allies, but friends, as you all are doing this thing. We have, let me speak for myself, I don't have the energy that I used to, and I don't have the creativity that you all do. But what I do have, I offer and I give you, because at the end, it's not you or me, it's and. It's not me or Jesse, it's and. It's all of us are trying to make this better. And there are things that you all are going through that I have no idea about and may not understand, but so I need you to school me so that I can use my bully pulpit on your behalf and get y'all what you need. Just as we also need to support brothers like Jonathan Swain, who did not back up, who did not pack up, who did not move, who did not go to an online business, who is still hiring brothers and sisters to get them jobs and to stay in this community, even though he suffered because of some of the community, but he understood why he suffered. It wasn't directly because of the community, it was what happened to the community, right? And so I am here just to let everybody know that we are here to end this thing together. If GAPA and CPAC can come together and create the ECPS, imagine what we really can do when we decide to really come together and make something happen. So that's what I see. I see the rainbow is an insult to describe the unity that is really going on that no one really knows about because they're not paying attention, right? There are so many of us doing this work that has been inspired and reminded why we have to do this work and stay in this work and lean on each other and help each other through this work as we get through this process. So I am encouraged. I am excited. I am rejuvenated. I'm here to help. I'm here to support however way we can. and Kobe can testify. GAPA and CPAC come together is the greatest example that I can think of what a unity statement really is.
Absolutely. I also want to lastly add the coalition building that we've seen take place in the last year. I mean, the unity between Black and Brown communities. We had Puerto Rican communities flying Puerto Rican flags in honor of Black Lives Matter. We had Mexican communities, Palestinian communities. We had communities ensuring that they used their own social capital to ensure that the country understood that Black Lives Matter and that other communities firmly believed that and would stand with it. And that is a coalition building that we cannot let go, right? Just because the moment's not hot, just because the cameras are not on, does not mean we let that coalition building, that unity that brought us together, that ensures that two coalitions could come together and agree on an ordinance, right? With different tactics and different political beliefs, that we can still come together and we can do the work. We've seen that with 2020. We don't have to agree on everything, but we know what's right and we can stand on the right side of history and fight for justice. And I think that 2020 calls for us to continue that relationship building.
I also just want to add, to what Jesse said, we don't always have unity of ideas, but we do have unity of action. We're united by being in the same community, by being, affected by the same problems. So, when it's time to mobilize, we have to be together. I consider myself to be pretty young. I'm in my early 20s, and I've seen, people much younger than me, at these protests, taking leading roles, with the bullhorn in their hands, fearless, just like charging forward. And that is such a source of optimism because, before the uprising, like when I first started organizing it, at times it felt hopeless. At times we'd show up to protest and there'd be like 5-10 people there. So to go from that to tens of thousands of people in the streets, and all these different solidarity demonstrations. Like recently, there were about 25,000 people in the streets for Palestine, and they were chanting Black Lives Matter as well. And that's what I want this moment to be remembered for. And I want it to be remembered as the beginning of something that really systemically changed this country and the world.
Well, believe it or not, we're already at 7 o'clock. So I just want to thank you all for taking the time to share with us what you all have been going through. So just as we wrap up, if there's any last thoughts that you all have, or also, especially since all of you are really in the trenches of doing this type of work, which can be pretty taxing, if there's something that has kept you going through the past year that you want to share.
For me, it's been watching our communities be relentless, right? Jonathan said it perfectly, mirroring the racial injustices that we've seen televised by the murder of George Floyd and the protests that arose from that murder, mirroring that with the pandemic, and still watching folks in our community get up every morning and try again. Get up every morning and go to that protest. Get up every morning and say, we're still gonna fight for our community because we deserve justice. If we can watch our people, despite the trauma and the pain, get up every morning and fight for it, that's what makes me get up every morning and fight for it, right? We need each other more than we understand. And I think that the amount of community building we have been able to witness has been inspiring, despite everything else, right? Despite all of the wrong that we see in our country, we have become a very large community that leans on one another to ensure that we can achieve what we're seeking. And so that for me has been the most inspiring thing in the last year. And we've done it, whether that's through Zoom, a FaceTime, a phone call, where you throw your mask on and you hit the streets. We've been in community.
Yeah, I also want to. There was a question that I wanted to respond to in the that came up in the chat that says, well, there's all these murders in Chicago and there's all this violence, and doesn't focusing on the police, distract from public safety. And I mentioned this earlier, but the root causes of the violence are not things that police are equipped to solve, and even in their capacity, what they're supposed to be doing, quote unquote, serve and protect the community. If they're not doing that, then what are they doing? They're not keeping people safe. They're not solving murders. They're not, they're definitely not fixing the root cause of the murders. What they're doing is harassing and terrorizing people, and these are people who are already being neglected systematically, who are already watching all the institutions that would actually benefit their lives being shut down. So, for me, it's we need to change this this discourse around Black and brown communities as being communities of problems. Where some outside force, like some politician, some corporate entity needs to come in and fix our problems. These are communities who, if we had the resources to fix things for ourselves, we would. We would absolutely be doing way better if we were empowered and if we had the resources that we need. So that's the final thing I want to say is, to anyone who's watching, people are a resource too, so get involved. If you're not involved already, there's a whole bunch of organizations on this panel, so you can find your movement home and get involved in doing that work for your community, doing that work to improve the community and to actually keep people safe.
Well, with that, we'll wrap up. I just want to thank everyone that was part of the panel for taking the time to be here with us virtually tonight, hopefully in the future in person. We want to thank the Chicago Sun-Times and again, the Chicago Community Trust, who, thanks to a generous grant, funds my position here at the Chicago Sun-Times. And again, thanks to that grant, all of the stories that I write are never behind a paywall. But we do want to encourage you out there, if you have the means to support local journalism, to consider doing so by getting a subscription to the Chicago Sun-Times, which will keep me and my colleagues going in the future. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night and stay safe.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Elvia, if we make sure that these continue, I would love to be on future panels going forward. That would definitely help us out.
Okay, I'll definitely keep you